Right, good morning everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're going to talk today about ERP projects. We've worked on a few at Sharpe's over the years, and what we've noticed is that they throw up similar issues. So we thought we'd pull them together into a fairly short webinar and just talk through them so that hopefully if you're planning on procuring an ERP project, these will be helpful pointers for you. In terms of timings, we're hoping to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So if you've got any questions as we go through the slides, please do just use the Q&A function and we'll pick them up at the end and do our best to answer them. So just to start, my name is Julia Rudin. I'm currently the managing partner at Sharpe Pritchard and a partner in our IT and data team. I've advised on IT procurements for many years, and more recently a number of ERP projects. So just passing to Gemma, who's also going to be talking today.
Thanks, Julia. So yes, I'm Gemma Townley. I'm a partner in our technology and data team at Sharpe Pritchard. I've been with the firm for over 10 years, and in that time I've seen a vast array of different ERP projects. So yeah, hoping to impart some of that knowledge to you today. So I think with that introduction, we'll move to the slides.
Great. So yes, that's what we're talking about today. ERP projects for the public sector. This is who we are with our contact details. So if you've got any questions that occur to you afterwards, do just email Gemma or I, and we'll be happy to help. So what are we going to cover today? We're firstly going to look at what is ERP, explain the initials and basically what the ERP systems are all about, and look at some of the pre-procurement issues, some of the potential benefits and disadvantages of ERP systems. We're then in the second part going to look at some of the procurement issues that are relevant to ERP procurements. And then finally, we're going to look at some of the contractual issues that they throw up. Okay, so moving on to what is ERP? Great. Okay, so to start with, what do the initials stand for? It stands for Enterprise Resource Planning. I've never actually thought that gives much of a hint about what the system actually does. But what it is supposed to do is it's a business process management software that allows an organization to manage its business units in a cohesive way by automating its back office functions. Typically, a system will use various integrated applications, or often called modules, and the ones we typically see are HR, finance, procurement. It's worth saying ERP systems have been around for quite a while. They're extensively used, certainly in the private sector, but also increasingly in the public sector. They allow business units to share information, so data is produced in a consistent, organized way, and the system should follow industry best practice and procedures. Historically, ERP systems have in the past been provided on-premise. What that means is that the system would be hosted on the customer's own servers, located in its premises, with the authority typically owning and maintaining those servers. But increasingly, what we've seen is a definite shift to cloud-based ERP systems. This is where the services are delivered and used over the internet rather than having local servers. Cloud-based products are standardized. They tend to be out-of-the-box products, typically offered to a large number of customers. Okay. Right, so I thought before we go into the real detail, it'd be worth just looking at what are the potential benefits of ERP systems, what are they supposed to deliver, what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve. So this isn't meant to be a sort of sales pitch for ERP systems, but I think it's worth thinking about the objectives that we're trying to achieve here. So the first one, and in no particular order, improved efficiency and collaboration. So what they should do is reduce the time and effort required by your end users to carry out their jobs and activities. You should see a reduction in manual processes, which can be, as we know, very time consuming. They should be streamlining the process of collaborating with other parts of your organization through access to data. And through that efficiency and automation, it should reduce costs. Now, I say should, and I'm going to come to the whole cost question in a bit. But what it should do is what you're seeing is you're spending your money rather than on multiple systems, all with their own dedicated staff and infrastructure and support teams. You're focusing your spend on one system. So just through that, through coordinating your back office systems, you should see a reduction in the overall cost. It should also hopefully mean you have a reduced training need because you're training people in one system rather than multiple different systems. And in theory, you should have a reduction in the cost of future changes because you'll be sharing the cost of those with all the other users of the system, all the other customers. So there should be a reduction in the cost of future changes. Another benefit would be improved and automated management information, giving better visibility to your decision makers. So an ERP system should be giving you a single unified reporting system for every process. Still looking at the benefits then, data security. ERP systems have built-in intrinsic controls and a single repository for all the information, providing centralized backups of critical data. So really, it should be giving you better data security. System integration and a drive to standardize your business processes. ERP systems sit right at the heart of that. And clearly, if you can integrate your systems better, standardize processes, everything should work better across your organization. And through all of those benefits, what one obvious objective and outcome we would be hoping to achieve is just a better end user experience. So people have been given the tools to really do their job more effectively and more simply. So again, that is a key objective often when people go into ERP procurements. Okay, so that was the upside, but what are the potential pitfalls, certainly that we've seen on projects we've been involved in? I said I'd come back to it. Well, cost. These systems are not cheap. They represent a fairly significant investment by the client. And that's really because they involve often quite large upfront license fees, the cost of implementing the system, and then the ongoing maintenance and support costs. But it's not just the costs that you might be paying to the supplier, it's also your own internal costs, particularly during the implementation phase in the lead up to the system going live. If we're going to look in a minute at if there are delays during implementation, but I mean, really the implementation costs on the client as you're implementing these systems can't be overlooked. Another potential pitfall is if customization of the system gets out of hand. As I said previously, these are often intended to be out-of-the-box products. Customization of them or configuration, if it's needed, takes time, effort, expertise, usually the suppliers, and money. there's sometimes we've seen a temptation to lean on customization when the system you've chosen doesn't quite meet your requirements. So essentially what you might have is a bit of a square peg into a round hole, and you've got your users saying, oh, well, I want this bit of functionality, please can you give it to me? And it leads to a bit more customization. Where you sit on that dial is going to directly influence how expensive this system is going to become. So you've got to have control of customization and be really realistic about how much it's going to cost. Another potential sort of downside if you heavily customize your ERP system is it might just reduce the best practices that have been built into the system, and you might find it makes future upgrades more difficult because your supplier will be pushing out standard upgrades that rely on the system being fairly standardized. If your systems become highly bespoke, that just might make upgrades more difficult. And finally, just complexity. ERP software solutions are fairly sophisticated. They often have numerous capabilities and functionality, but that can mean that the software is complex and can become difficult to use. So what you need to think about is, do you actually need all the bells and whistles that are on offer with a particular ERP system? Just pause to think about what actually your organization needs, because sometimes keeping it simple can be best. It can, if a system becomes frankly difficult to use, you're going to find user take up just might also be quite difficult. Okay, so some of the key considerations when you're going into an ERP project. What type of solution do you want? Do you want it to be on-premise, or are you looking for a cloud-based system? Is a change program within your organization needed? Often ERP projects and systems have a large number of users. I mean, one I worked on recently had 6,000 users on the system. Moving to a new system with such a large group of users, it just can't be done with a flick of a switch. You've got to take your users with you. So almost certainly you're going to need some form of internal change management program. Thinking about business case sign-off and approvals, how much money have you got to spend? What contingencies do you need for the unexpected? All of those need to be thought about upfront and probably regularly revisited. The next question for public sector procurers is obviously, what is your route to market? What procurement procedure are you going to use? And then also just thinking about the contract structure, because that will influence your procurement strategy as well. And Gemma's going to talk about both of those in the next session. Okay, some things to think about before going into your procurement. Understanding the market that you're bringing your procurement to. It's a good idea to warm the market up. Cloud-based ERP suppliers generally are a fairly small pool, and they have particular ways of working and contracting. So to go to market without having had any engagement with them would be a pretty big risk. What you need to do is to try and structure your procurement to attract a good range and mix of both suppliers and products, so that you have a genuine choice. And to do that, you've got to have an idea of some of the market's concerns. So it's a very good idea to think about pre-market engagement. Existing legacy systems, if you're moving from an existing ERP system to a new one, you need to give some thought to whether you need exit negotiations with that supplier. Having an understanding about who's going to extract and migrate the data. Will that be your incumbent supplier? Will it be you? Will it be the new supplier? Do you have an exit plan in place? Is there an exit management schedule in your existing contract? Do they have to do certain exit activities free of charge, or will they charge for it? And if so, you probably need to be including that cost in your business case. So something certainly quite a big area of activity, just how you exit from the existing contract. Okay, just continuing with some of the supplier concerns that we've seen highlighted on market engagement exercises. Thinking about the structure, so the majority of software as a service suppliers, so these will be your typical cloud-based suppliers of ERP systems, they don't carry out the implementation of their solution themselves. So usually you'll be looking at awarding 2 contracts, one for the implementer and one for the actual supplier of the product. Many SaaS providers have accredited partners that they typically work with and who know their product. So you can see that actually how you procure might actually, you've got to think in advance about the different permutations. Contract term, this is another issue that is certainly flagged by SaaS suppliers that we've seen in market sounding exercises. The initial contract term is usually no more than 5 to 7 years, with the majority of suppliers saying they prefer a shorter term of about 3 years. Sometimes then with an option to have a conversation about the solution and the costs before triggering any extension. Now, I think from the supplier's perspective, the reason they're nervous about longer contract terms is really twofold. It's firstly the difficulty in pricing accurately 4 or 5 years out, and secondly, it's just the uncertainty about their technology roadmap for longer periods of time. They just might not know what's going to be happening with their solution, what advances will be made, what changes will be made. So there's just a nervousness about longer contract terms. Interesting to note that the 5 to 7 years we've seen bidders saying they prefer aligns quite well with the terms in 2 of the commonly used frameworks. That's the DAS framework, Data and Application Services framework, and the G Cloud. Okay. Public sector terms, this is another one that suppliers are often quite nervous about. They are often quite spooked by things like TUPE if there's a potential for council staff to transfer them at the outset of the contract. Things like service levels, they often will not want to amend them for a particular client. They have a standard offering around that. And what we often find is the standard terms maybe don't align to some of the terms that public sector clients will often expect to see, like around freedom of information, that kind of thing. So there will undoubtedly be some discussion around terms. Personal data, obviously under GDPR, we have the right to be forgotten. Some systems don't appear to have the ability to delete personal information. They may have the ability to archive it, but not necessarily to delete it. So it's just understanding what the system's limitations are will be quite important. Finally, just a bit about user communities. Most suppliers offer a level of support as standard to deal with day-to-day support issues, patches, etc., but may be reluctant to offer anything more than their standard offering. And where your system is sort of business critical, you might find that the standard offering isn't quite good enough. So again, an area for discussion. Just very quickly, thinking at the outset just about risk allocation. Obviously, guiding principle, risks should be borne by the party best placed to manage them. It's a fairly well understood risk allocation principle, but not always followed. I think sometimes the temptation can just be to transfer all risk to the other party, but if they're going to struggle to manage that risk, maybe not the best approach. So just at the outset, identifying, assessing, and working out the potential impact of the different risks you might be facing on the project, and then working out a strategy for how to manage them. Work out your red lines. What are your must-haves? It's very good to try and work that out at an early stage, because it just can inform the whole process. And then considering the services that you're procuring and the products just in light of the market. Okay, so now pass over to Gemma just to talk about some of the procurement considerations.
Thank you, Julia. So yes, in part 2 of this webinar, we look at the key considerations a contracting authority will need to be aware of when procuring an ERP system. Because of the specific nature of ERP systems, there are certain nuances that set an ERP project apart from other complex IT projects, such as the complexity in contract structure and complexities in ERP integration configuration that mean certain procurement procedures may be more suitable than others. So I mentioned there that one of the key nuances or complexities in an ERP project is the contract structure. And what I mean by this is that whereas in a traditional IT outsourcing, you would ordinarily expect a contract with one company. So for example, if you were going out to procure a network or Wi-Fi broadband, you might expect to contract with a BT or a Vodafone. In an ERP scenario, the key players in the market will expect to enter into at least 2 contracts. So one will be for the SaaS product, so that is the application itself. And the other will be for the implementation partner, who will be responsible for implementing that SaaS product with your IT systems that are already in existence. There may be more than 2 contracts. If, for example, you award to a best of breed solution and you want a direct contractual relationship with all of your SaaS providers, instead of allowing one company to be the prime. So a best of breed solution would typically be where you have one company that is the best in their class for one of the modules or applications. So for example, the HR, and you have a different company for the other modules. So best provider for the finance package, for example. And what that does is widen your ERP provider ecosystem, and potentially you are going to be entering into more than 2 contracts in that scenario. So there are different procurement options depending on how many contracts, but on the assumption that there will be 2 contracts, we have set out the different options. So the first option is where you conduct one procurement with a view to awarding 2 contracts. Under this option, you are asking the market to link up and tender a whole solution to you. So the onus is on the bidders to provide a cohesive solution. You can reserve the right to award one contract if the same entity is providing both the SaaS and the implementation services, and we are aware that there is at least 1 or 2 players in the market that do offer both. The second option is to run one procurement in 2 lots. The difficulty with this option is that if you run those lots in parallel, the implementer will not know what SaaS product they're implementing at the time of the procurement, which obviously means that that second lot, in terms of the implementation partner, might not be as meaningful as you would like it to be. The third option is running 2 procurements sequentially. If you run them in parallel, then you end up with the same difficulty as option 2. If you run them sequentially, it has the benefit of knowing in advance which SaaS product needs implementing. And there's 2 kind of key benefits with this. Firstly, it allows you to ensure that any dependencies the SaaS provider has on the implementer are properly articulated in your requirements for the implementer procurement. And secondly, it potentially allows you to run a quicker, more slicker procurement process for that implementation partner. So for example, you might be able to run a call off from an existing framework if you know the likely implementers for your SaaS product. So that second procurement could be much more tailored and targeted. And then there's a couple of other things to think about. Firstly, if you're considering procuring a solution on behalf of another contracting authority, then procuring a framework agreement may be suitable. Benefits with this are procurement savings born from running one procurement instead of multiple procurements, also from using the same specification and documents. and potentially you might receive a better price given the economies of scale, but that will be dependent on your particular circumstances. And secondly, with any of these options, an element of collaboration is going to be needed given the multi-supplier ecosystem that you're creating. So moving on to collaboration and integration, dependent on contract structure, this is going to be one of your key considerations. One of the key risks will be ensuring that there is effective collaboration and integration across the different contract suppliers and with the customer and its stakeholders and users. So you will likely need to publish a form of collaboration agreement with your procurement documents or include collaboration obligations in your contract. Which approach you take will be determined by how hands-on the contracting authority wants to be, but in our experience, a collaboration agreement is the most often used vehicle. The key to having an effective and operable collaboration agreement is making sure that it's not overly complicated and that you have identified key dependencies and responsibilities on the customer. Dependencies should be clearly articulated, and you can use the SMART formula to do so. So that is that dependencies should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. The collaboration agreement should be clear on how liability issues will be tackled. So, for example, if supplier A fails to deliver because of something supplier B hasn't done, does supplier A have the right to sue supplier B under that agreement? Or does the contracting authority want the channels of liability to be run through them? A point that is often missed is that the contracting authority knows its IT landscape better than anyone, and therefore the contracting authority is best placed to support and should fully expect to provide support to its integrator, and this is the integrating the integrator point. And that is collaboration must work both ways in order to achieve the best results. And finally, your collaboration partnership should have clarity on the service scope, so that the contracts knit together with no gaps. And that means that you'll need to consider where the solution design risk best sits, whether that is with the implementer or with the contracting authority itself. Moving on to which procurement procedure is most suitable for an ERP system, there is so much that can be said on this, and we've distilled this into 2 slides for time purposes today. Whilst the decision will depend on a number of factors, including the scope of the system, timescales, budgets, implementation model, and other factors, we have set out 3 of the most commonly used routes to market by public sector clients. So firstly, a call-off from an existing framework. There are a number of existing frameworks that could be used. So, for example, Julia mentioned it previously, the CCS Data and Application Services Framework, the reference is RM 3821, or the G-Cloud framework. Using a existing framework is most typically used for smaller ERP systems, or where only one module is being purchased, or perhaps where complex integration issues are not so relevant. It can also be used to procure your implementation partner. So in terms of the advantages of using a call-off from an existing framework, the call-off terms are already set. So in theory, your suppliers have bought into those T's and C's, and there shouldn't be much toing and froing on those. Timescales, generally, it's quite a quick process to call off from a framework agreement, whether you do that by way of direct award or mini competition. And the framework for your requirements will already be included in the framework specification, so you're not starting from scratch. Some of the disadvantages of a call-off from a framework agreement include that you are restricted by the framework terms itself, so you are restricted by the scope, so you must check that the scope you want to procure is included in that umbrella of the framework, and the contract terms. So as Julia said, the Data and Application Services framework only allows a maximum term of 7 years, and G-Cloud only allows a maximum term of 4 years. You also might not be able to address complex issues such as implementation if you use a call-off from a framework agreement, just because you can't have that level of dialogue or negotiation with your suppliers. And you're more than likely going to need to be able to specify your requirements up front. So if there's any fluidity or any unknowns in your requirements at the outset, calling off from a framework agreement might not be the most suitable route for you. And then secondly, the restricted procedure. This is one of the less complex standalone procurements. There are no conditions for using the procedure, so you can choose to use it. And it is run as a two-stage process where you firstly down select bidders based on a standard selection questionnaire, which primarily looks at the bidder, and then secondly evaluates tenders for the contract and annual specification and requirements. So in terms of the advantages of the restricted procedure, timescales is one, so generally it is one of the more quicker standalone processes. It's helpful if you don't have the time and resource to run a more complex procedure. One of the sort of downsides is that ERP systems often have complex integration and configuration arrangements that cannot be fully explored in a restricted procedure because you're not permitted to have that dialogue or negotiation with your bidders during the process. One of the ways to try and mitigate that is to, as Julia said, conduct some pre-market testing before you go to market in a formal way. Some of the other disadvantages of the restricted procedure, so it's not suitable if you can't define your requirements at the outset, and that's because there's no ability during the procedure to change your requirements. Bidders have to submit tenders based on the requirements that you set out at the outset, so your requirements do need to be fairly well known at that point. And there is a risk in the restricted procedure because of the lack of contact with your bidders during the procedure. That you end up with a supplier who cannot sign up to the standard terms and conditions. And what that does is force the contracting authority to take sort of one or two routes, either abandon the procedure because they feel that the procurement risk is too high, or it forces the contracting authority to take on some procurement risk in order to award the contract. So, as I said, one of the ways to mitigate that would be to conduct market testing on red lines that suppliers have. And as long as you have taken that on board and have actually done something about that, then that risk should be mitigated. The last procedure that we're going to look at is the competitive dialogue procedure, which is one of the complex standalone procedures together with the competitive procedure with negotiation. It can only be used in certain circumstances. These circumstances are set out in Regulation 26, subsection 4 of the Public Contracts Regulations 2015. So, for example, they set out certain grounds when you can use it. One of those grounds would be where your procurement includes some element of design or innovative solutions. Another ground is where the contracts cannot be awarded without prior negotiation because of specific circumstances relating to the nature and complexity of the contract. So before you use the competitive dialogue procedure, you'll need to consider if you meet one of those grounds in Regulation 26.4. If you do and you choose to use it, then it's a multiple stage process, and it gives you the ability to meet with and dialogue with bidders during the process. So it's typically more suitable for large scale ERP systems and where there is some complex integration elements. In terms of the advantages of the competitive dialogue route, as I've said, it allows maximum bidder contact, which hopefully maximises the potential for good quality bids. It's suitable for more complex procurements where perhaps you're unable to define all of your requirements at the outset. So, for example, where you might be seeking innovative solutions, or perhaps there's some fluidity in terms of your configuration arrangements that you don't quite know at the outset and that need to be developed. You also have the ability to develop specifications with more precision during the procedure, and you can start building a relationship with your suppliers at the earliest opportunity because you get to speak to them. You can negotiate after receipt of the final tenders as well. And so what that means at a preferred bidder stage is that you will have a good idea of the different solutions and bidder red lines, and therefore that risk of ending up with a supplier who is unwilling to sign up to your terms and conditions is much reduced. Some disadvantages of the competitive dialogue procedure: timescales is an obvious one. As I said, it's a multi-stage process, which means it's usually more than 2 stages, so it does tend to take a bit more time. It's resource heavy by its nature. You're holding dialogue sessions, and that comes with lots of preparation and debriefing, so it's usually more resource intensive, and that in turn means it's usually more costly to run. There are things that you can do to control that. So, for example, you could consider streamlining the dialogue to predefined topics to try and keep it on track and to make sure that the dialogue doesn't run away from you. So if you opt for one of the more complex procedures, you'll need to consider how you conduct the dialogue or negotiation. In order to negotiate confidently and with credibility, you'll need to prepare properly. A well-planned, clearly explained and transparent process gives bidders confidence, it shows credibility, and it saves time in the long run. You should take the time to understand the different negotiation strands and issues and how they link to the legal and commercial issues. This will assist with setting the agendas, determining your tactics, and who needs to be attending those negotiation sessions. You should anticipate suppliers' issues, so you're not taken by surprise, but you know how to respond. You may also anticipate common issues across all suppliers, in which case you need to be thinking about making sure that you are treating all of your bidders equally and fairly. You should document all of your sessions, so that might include agendas, issue lists for tracking progress, and a template for note-taking or minute-taking. Training is likely to be important, particularly if there are team members who are unfamiliar with the process or who have never conducted negotiations or dialogue before. This can be combined with preparing a negotiation or dialogue plan. And given the current circumstances that we find ourselves in, there may be virtual dialogue or negotiations to enable social distancing. This brings with it some other challenges that you might not get in a face-to-face setting. So in terms of tackling those, you should use your internal preparation to assign roles and know who will lead. You should also consider using smaller audiences to have more focused calls. And you should also take the time at the beginning of the session to build rapport as you lose that natural kind of bedding in period that you would normally get with a face-to-face meeting. So then just a word on evaluation, and again, there's lots that can be said on evaluation, so we just picked out a few key tips here today. So the evaluation methodology and criteria will be a key issue for you to consider. Firstly, the use of pass-fail criteria should be for genuine must-have requirements only. The more prescriptive you are with pass-fail requirements, the more likely that you risk excluding certain solutions. So these devices should be used sparingly and only where failure would make the bid unacceptable. You must also clearly set out the consequences of a failure. So if one failure of the pass-fail criteria means excluding the tenderer and rejecting the tender, that should be made absolutely clear to your bidders. Secondly, avoid overcomplicating the criteria methodology. We tend to see sometimes a temptation to have lots of criteria. In one case, the NDA case, the contracting authority had over 700 individual elements to evaluate, which meant that the claimant had lots of targets to attack, and the scores were so close that overturning a couple of scores affected the outcome. So it's in both the contracting authority's interest and also the bidder's interest to have a sort of simplified or simple, as far as you can, methodology and criteria. Explore different evaluation models for pricing evaluation, so whether that is evaluating the total cost of ownership or by reference to medians and means. All models that evaluate pricing have their pros and cons, and these can be modelled and profiled so that you understand those sort of limitations and restrictions of them. And it is possible to clarify tenders that are imprecise. You should use clarifications when needed, but you must make sure you treat all bidders equally and fairly when you do so. So I'm now going to hand back to Julia, who's going to start off talking about some of the contractual considerations and common issues in ERP projects.
Great, thank you, Gemma. So I think the first issue to just talk about is, and we've mentioned this before, ERP systems that are cloud-based tend to be offered as software as a service, which means they'll come with some standard SaaS contract terms. Suppliers typically offer standard terms to their customers for that product, and what we found is that they are quite reluctant to amend those terms for one particular client. I mean, obviously, the larger and the more valuable your contract is, the more clout you're going to have to move them or enhance or improve those terms. But it's worth bearing in mind that is a particular issue with SaaS products. Key areas that you might find don't offer you sufficient protection are around limits on liability. I've seen SaaS terms where the general limit on liability was £10,000, which, you know, if it's a product that's going out and going to be used by thousands of your users and is business critical, probably is not going to be sufficient. GDPR, we've seen fairly light GDPR provisions in SaaS terms. TUPE, they tend not to be any TUPE provisions in SaaS terms. Availability and service hours is often a standard offering that might or might not meet your requirements. As I said, difficult to negotiate the terms, so it's probably best to focus on your key issues, you know, your really must have provisions, and just be prepared that you might see an uplift in prices if you're trying to negotiate what the supplier would consider gold-plated arrangements. Okay, implementation. On virtually every major ERP system we've been involved in, there have been delays during the implementation phase, and that's sometimes because maybe the initial implementation plan was quite challenging, you know, maybe overly optimistic about how quickly things can be implemented, but essentially ERP systems are fairly complex, and the implementation phase is quite high risk. So delays may well occur. The implementation, as Gemma has said, carried out by the implementation partner, but you just need to pause and think about what might be the best implementation approach. I mean, we could talk for a long time about the difference between an agile delivery and a waterfall delivery. Essentially, waterfall is the more traditional approach, where you have a set of sequential milestones that your supplier has to hit, and they only get paid once they've achieved that milestone. But the problem is that as soon as you run into delay, you're going to be basically at loggerheads and start to get into whose fault the delay is. It's a particular problem where some of your requirements are not fully formed at the outset. Very difficult to predict right at the outset how long it will take to implement something that isn't fully understood or known. And so to address that, it might be worth thinking about whether you bring in a bit more of an agile approach to your delivery, which typically involves smaller pieces of work with a lot of collaboration and interaction between the customer and the supplier, just to test things out before you move to the next piece of work. So what we're saying is maybe avoid lock-in to unrealistic milestones and plans, where contractual remedies might be quite punitive and do not necessarily encourage open and honest conversations and a collaborative solution to meeting the delay. Okay, just to pass over now back to Gemma just to conclude.
Thanks, Julia. So a further key consideration for your users will be usability of the ERP system and whether the ERP system will be fit for purpose. Your contract document should articulate the overall goals of the project, whether that might be improving efficiencies or reducing costs, and we call this the product vision. And then at the lower level, you should include user stories in your specifications, so including the roles of people who are going to be using the system and then the tasks that they may want to carry out on a day-to-day basis. As part of your procurement, you can also consider including user demonstrations if your procedure allows it. You will need to consider how you evaluate these if at all. It's common to use a user demonstration as a sort of verification exercise of scores already assigned to the written submissions. And then data protection is a big issue for ERP systems and should be a key consideration of your ERP procurement because personal data is likely to be a key component of the data stored on that ERP system. You may also be migrating from an on-premise solution to a cloud-based solution, which means you will be considering where that data will be hosted and the safeguards that will need to be in place. Privacy by design is a concept that's been around for a while, but the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, codified the principle and enshrined them into law. Article 25 of the GDPR requires controllers to implement appropriate technical and organisational measures, both at the time of processing and at the time of determination of the means of processing. So data protection should therefore be at the forefront of the procurement process when determining the solution that is right for your organisation. Colleagues in your data security, information management teams, as well as your data protection officer, if you have one, should be consulted. One way to ensure that privacy by design is being considered is to conduct a data protection impact assessment, or a DPIA. A DPIA is required by law when processing is likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals, so in particular when using new technologies. When determining whether a DPIA is required, have regard to the ICO's guidance, and the ICO's website is particularly helpful on that front. It should be clear in your contracts who is going to be responsible for the extraction and migration of the data, as Julia mentioned previously. You may also need to liaise with your incumbent supplier. Sometimes we see that a sort of test environment is required so that the incumbent supplier can pull all of the data off the legacy system into the test environment, which then the new supplier can then pull and put into the new system. There tend to be other issues with that. So, for example, the legacy system may not have the data stored in the right data fields and codes for the new system. So there's a whole question around who will be doing that work and where that sits. As the ERP provider is likely to be the processor, you must ensure that the Article 28 requirements of GDPR are complied with. Article 28 requires sufficient guarantees to meet GDPR requirements. And you may also need to consider where data will be hosted and backed up to. So, for example, if you want your data to be hosted and backed up to the UK, then that must be clearly specified. So that sort of brings us to the top tips, really, in terms of bringing everything together that me and Julia have spoken about this morning. So we've put some top tips up there. So the first one is to consider changes that may be required internally. So it's that question of whether moving to new business processes and policies need to be actually rolled out throughout your organisation, and bringing your staff along on that journey. You should choose the procurement procedure to fit your requirements. You should keep flexibility on contract structure to widen the competition. So as we mentioned before, there are different models that providers use, so you need to try and keep it flexible so that you encourage and keep that competition wide. You should consider risk allocation and be realistic about where that risk best sits. You should also consider the balance between standardization and customization. So as Julia mentioned, the more customization, the more gold-plated the suppliers will see it, likely to increase costs. You should also consider the benefits of Waterfall versus Agile development and delivery. You should consider contractual red lines, and you should be clear on your position throughout the procurement on those. You should also identify interdependencies and the appropriate contract vehicle for where they sit. And you should choose an evaluation methodology to fit your key aims. So that concludes everything that we wanted to chat through this morning and discuss. If you want to find out more, then all of our ERP resources are online on our website, or feel free to contact either myself or Julia. Again, our email addresses are there on the slide, so jrudin@sharpepritchard.co.uk and gtownley@sharpepritchard.co.uk. I think that probably just leaves us with whether there are any questions. So we'll give it a minute just to see if any questions come in, and if not, we'll close the webinar down. Okay, nothing's coming up. So in that case, we will close the webinar down, and thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye.